drummers have divided opinion over the past couple of decades in quite the same way as Meg White. To her detractors, of which there have been many, she's a stubbornly simple percussionist whose drumming style started basic and never evolved. But ask those on the other side of the argument and they'll tell you that to criticize her playing for a lack of complexity is to completely miss the point, like criticizing the bicycle for its lack of wheels. In her band The White Stripes, alongside the gale force propulsions of Jack White, Meg played her drums with an elemental ferocity, tearing chunks out of rock and roll heritage until only its beating heart remained. And then, after a career in which she rose from the dingy recesses of the underground garage rock scene all the way to Grammy-winning stardom, she called it quits, retreating into willful obscurity. It all began at a restaurant in the northern suburbs of Detroit. It was the mid-90s and a teenage Meg had a job serving food, while Jack Gillis, as Jack White was then known, sometimes appeared as one of the arty high school seniors performing at the restaurant's open mic sessions. The pair struck up a relationship and by 1996 they were married, with Jack taking Meg's last name. Not that any of this would become public knowledge until years later, but we'll come back to that. Jack had been playing in bands for some time, gathering all the component parts that would later become the ramshackle, rambunctious White Stripes machine, scratchy garage rock, hell for leather punk and stripped down blues. He had been making a name for himself on the rock scene in Detroit, but it was on a summer's day in 1997 that things changed for good. As Meg recalled to Modern Drummer in 2002, we actually had a drum set up in the house, and basically I just went up there one day and sat down and started drumming on it. Jack started playing some guitar and it just kind of went from there. He appreciated the childlike element in it because I hadn't really figured out the drums yet. Barely a month later, the White Stripes had their first gig at a bar in Detroit, and in the spring of 1998 their debut single was pressed onto vinyl and released into the world with only 1,000 copies. 2 minutes of bellicose guitars, bare-bone drums, and man-on-the-edge vocals constituted the manic scribbles of a musical manifesto, from which the band would rarely waver. They continued apace with a self-titled debut album in 1999, followed a year and 5 days later with Distill, another thrillingly fundamental LP self-recorded on 8-track analog tape. Who was this duo sprung forth from the Detroit scene like rock and roll saviors? Were they husband and wife, or were they brother and sister, as they'd begun telling anyone who'd ask? Neither actually. In March 2000 they got divorced, but with Meg's insistence and Jack's relief, the band continued. The peculiar internal dynamics of the band and the cloak of mystery with which Meg and Jack hid the truth whenever they were asked about their relationship by fans or journalists created an air of intrigue around them, the kind marketing execs would kill for. But it wasn't only that, they had an undying commitment to the colours of red, white and black, whether that was on the album covers or with their onstage costumes. It was oddly compelling, giving the impression of a band whose aesthetic was innate rather than contrived, and they weren't only bound by colour. With the exception of the most austere embellishments, a double bass here or a tambourine there, Meg and Jack plunged deep caverns of creativity with only one guitar, single track vocals and a sparsely built drum kit. Snare, hi-hat, one tom, a floor tom, a crash and a ride. In 2001 the Stripes cracked the mainstream with their third album White Blood Cells, which many consider to be their finest work. It produced one of their all-time great singles, Fell in Love with a Girl, as well as one of their most popular live tracks, Dead Leaves and The Dirty Ground. The album was actually re-released on a major label, V2, in 2002. By this point, much of the band's early mystique had been wiped clear, with proof of their marriage and subsequent divorce published in the press. It didn't matter though, as Meg and Jack were already marching down a path towards the stardom they would achieve with their next album, 2003's Elephant. As a record, it clung tightly to those precious White Stripe standards, entirely forgoing any electronic recording techniques in favour of an 8-track and decades-old gear. But it was a very modern hit. The hardest button to button, the third single release from the album, was endured as a favourite in the Stripes' discography, but it was merely a splash compared to the atom bomb of a lead single, Seven Nation Army.
Don't wanna hear about it. Every single one's got a story.
It stands undeniably as one of the world's most famous riffs of any era and has morphed into a true anthem. Go to any major sporting event in Europe, the US or beyond, and there's a decent chance you'll hear it bellowed from the speakers or from the fans on the terraces. 2 years later in 2005, the band returned with another album, Get Behind Me Satan. It was a sonic shift with growling guitars swapped largely for piano and other acoustic instruments while retaining that minimalist grit.
Well, women and shit from your kids is not the man in my life, I know. And I've been going to mystery.
And then in 2007, the duo delivered their 6th and final album, Icky Thump. In hindsight, it almost feels like a victory lap, reclaiming some of those early blues and punk influences with customary muscularity. Throughout all of that, with 6 albums and multiple tours crammed into 8 years, Meg's drumming was a constant. There were minor tweaks here and there, but all things considered, her crunching, combative beats were just as crucial to the Stripe's success as Jack's freewheeling frenzies. So let's dig a little deeper into what made her such a rare force. We'll take it back to 1998, and with a song we heard earlier, that first ever single, Let's Shake Hands. It's crucial to understanding the Meg White formula and shows how the Stripes did so much with so little. Jack's guitars are boisterous but firmly adhere to that classic 12-bar blues structure. It's a self-imposed restriction, but with Meg, at this point in her career at least, that wasn't the case. By the time the single was recorded, she'd only been playing drums for a matter of months. As a result, her role in the song was about providing as much momentum and potency as possible, getting there via the shortest, most straightforward route. And that's what she did, so much so that she can play the track with just one hand. The style seemed to be one of necessity, but it worked, and by what appears to be a magnificent accident, it created the no-nonsense sound that, in a US rock market dominated by bloated nu metal, made the Stripes stand out among the rabble. That approach of minimum fuss for maximum effect was all over the first album. On the track Cannon, Jack's doomy riff is darkened a few shades further by Meg's ominous beat, all synchronized thwacks of snare, kick and crash. One of the laziest assumptions made about the White Stripes during their early days is that Jack would have been annoyed by Meg's style, that it somehow put a ceiling on Jack's ambitions. In fact, in a 2005 interview with Rolling Stone, Jack was asked exactly that, and whether, to quote, Meg's style is too limiting, that you can't take a song as far as you'd like it to go, to which White responded with an emphatic no, adding, Meg is the best part of this band. It never would have worked with anybody else because it would have been too complicated. He summed it up in the same interview with this line, I never thought, God, I wish Neil Peart was in this band. If you did, however, wish that Neil Peart was in your band, then the first step in developing that fantasy should be to watch our deep dive into the brain-melting brilliance of the Rush drummer. It's one of the many videos we've got covering some of the greatest players to ever get behind the kit. You can find it in the top right-hand corner now. For that and more, please do subscribe to the channel and drop us a like if you're enjoying our stuff. We'd massively appreciate it. Thank you. Now, back to Meg. Though her playing did often provide the steady base upon which Jack's erraticism could thrive, she wasn't afraid to square up to Jack's guitar work either. On Death Letter, the Sunhouse cover from The Steel, her beats veer away from steady rhythm to go punch for punch with the guitar, almost stumbling but never quite going down for the count. It's a similar story on Aluminum from White Blood Cells. Both are a good example of how intuitive her playing was. Being chucked into the deep end, joining the band as she did without any formal training, meant that her playing wasn't bound by the shackles of learned convention. Whereas drum teachers might try to mold a player to have limb dependence, and rightly so you'd probably say, Meg would routinely stack things up for ultimate power. Listen to how the snare and cymbal fall on the same beats in Fell in Love with a Girl, amping up the hysteria of Jack's head over heels lyrics. It all adds up to mean that Meg's drumming was, to give it the technical term, heavy as fuck. Proof that you don't need pummeling double bass pedals and up-teen cymbals to make a track feel like it could move heaven and earth. Meg was not a prolific interviewee. In fact, written or filmed evidence of her speaking is extremely limited by modern standards, let alone where she talks about her drumming. But there is this illuminating quote she gave to Modern Drummer. I appreciate other kinds of drummers who play differently, but it's not my style or what works for this band. I get criticism sometimes and I go through periods where it really bothers me, but then I think about it and I realize that this is what is really needed for this band, and I just try to have as much fun with it as possible. It speaks to a few things. Firstly, although her drumming style seems to have been born out of initial limitation and necessity when she first started to play, she then had the awareness to know that this was exactly what the band needed to reach its potential. To add more would be to lose something, and Meg understood that instinctively. It also sheds light on the steeliness she must have had while sticking to her guns. As she says, the criticism of her style was widespread and common, and although it might have been the easy thing to give in and adapt her style, she didn't. She had the bravery and self-assurance to persevere, and as a result, created some of the greatest rock music of the last 25 years. In 2007, things came to a screeching halt for the Stripes. Jack was operating in top gear creatively, playing with the White Stripes as well as his new band, the Raconteurs. But for Meg, the pressures of performing in one of America's biggest bands had built up to the point of fracture, and midway through a tour that year, she called the whole thing off, with a statement citing acute anxiety as the cause. Things went quiet for a while, with Jack assuring fans that a new album was in the works, but nothing ever materialized. Their final ever public performance was as musical guests on Conan O'Brien's late night show in 2009, where they performed We're Going to Be Friends from White Blood Cells. Knowing what we know now, the whole thing feels heavy with a sense of finality, and the fact that Meg isn't even playing the drums was a glaring sign that the end had pretty much arrived.
We sit side by side in every class. The teacher thinks I sound funny, but she loves the way you sing.
The White Stripes officially disbanded in 2011 and haven't played together since. Jack still plays Stripes tunes at his solo gigs, but Meg has more or less vanished from the public view, refusing interviews and avoiding any sort of spotlight. Her retreat from a life of fame has been characterized by some as a kind of tragedy, the sad endpoint for an artist who couldn't keep pace with the blistering world of music. But, as has always been the case with Meg, there is another perspective. Perhaps her disappearance was just the final, defiant step of a musician who, from start to finish, was intent on doing things her own way. Thank you so much for making it to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this video essay on Meg White. Please leave any thoughts or suggestions for other musicians you want us to cover down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.